Case 1. Jack Schaap. The world that Jack Schaap built was one of absolute control, where purity wasn't just preached from the pulpit, it was demanded, policed, and weaponized. In the opening moment of this story, the viewer is dropped straight into one of his packed Sunday night services at First Baptist Church of Hammond, where nearly 10,000 congregants sit shoulder to shoulder under bright stage lights that illuminate Schaap standing above them like a moral judge. His voice booms through the sanctuary as he delivers yet another blistering sermon on sexual sin, hammering the pulpit and declaring that any impurity is a doorway to destruction. Men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Parents tighten their grip on their children. Young women keep their eyes down, trained to carry the weight of modesty on their shoulders. And through it all, Jack stands as the self-appointed guardian of holiness, a man who seemed to embody the very purity he demanded from everyone else. The congregation believed him. They trusted him. They revered him as the unshakable pillar of righteousness in an increasingly sinful world. What they didn't know was that behind the scenes, and sometimes even during these fiery sermons, the man who thundered against sexual immorality was quietly arranging secret meetings with a 16-year-old girl he was supposed to be counseling. His rise to this level of power didn't happen overnight. Jack had married into the dynasty of the independent fundamental Baptist movement, stepping into leadership after the death of his father-in-law, Jack Hyles, one of the most influential and controversial preachers in modern American fundamentalism. Under Jack, the church grew even more rigid, more insulated, more obsessed with purity and obedience. He cultivated an image of flawless spiritual authority, turning his sermons into theatrical performances where he relentlessly condemned lust, pornography, and any hint of moral compromise. Young people in the congregation were taught to see him as the final word on holiness, the man who could interpret not just scripture, but the hidden intentions of their hearts. His counseling ministry became an extension of that authority, a place where he claimed to restore the fallen and guide vulnerable teenagers back onto the path of righteousness. It was under this guise of spiritual mentorship that he began cultivating a secret relationship with a teenage girl entrusted to his care. The grooming was subtle, calculated, and framed as pastoral concern. Jack used religious language to manipulate her emotions, convincing her that obedience to him was obedience to God. Messages were exchanged, meetings were arranged, trips were orchestrated under the pretense of spiritual development. What began as private counseling morphed into emotional dependency, and then into something unmistakably criminal. Jack took her across state lines, an act that would later form the backbone of federal charges, while continuing to preach fiery sermons about purity to the congregation he was betraying. All the while he maintained the image of a holy man waging war against sexual sin, even as he indulged in the very behavior he claimed to despise. It didn't take long for small cracks to form. Digital messages surfaced, texts that blurred the boundaries between pastor and predator. Church staff members noticed unusual time spent with the girl. Whispers began spreading among those who sensed something wasn't right. Eventually, the truth reached church leadership, and within days, the FBI was involved. Federal agents traced his communication patterns, travel records, and digital footprint, piecing together a timeline that revealed not just moral failure, but a crime that carried serious legal consequences: interstate transportation of a minor, exploitation under the guise of counseling, abuse of pastoral authority. Every detail deepened the sense of betrayal felt by the community that had trusted him for decades. The downfall was swift and devastating. Jack stood in federal court, no longer the commanding figure on the stage, but a man facing the consequences of his own hypocrisy. He received a 12-year federal prison sentence, a punishment that shattered the empire he had inherited and the persona he had so carefully crafted. The independent fundamental Baptist movement was left reeling, forced to confront the truth that the man who had preached the loudest about purity had been violating the very children he claimed to protect. For thousands who once sat under his sermons, the scandal wasn't just a crime, it was a personal devastation, a betrayal by a man who had positioned himself as the embodiment of holiness. And as he began his years behind bars, the congregation he left behind struggled to reconcile the image of the preacher they had worshipped with the predator he had become. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we dive into the stories the public wasn't supposed to see, the secrets behind the sermons, the scandals behind the smiles, and the hidden truths behind those who claim to stand for purity, holiness, and moral perfection. If you're drawn to deep-dive true crime documentaries that unravel manipulation, hypocrisy, and the shocking double lives of powerful figures, make sure you subscribe. We bring you more investigations just like this one, and trust me, the cases ahead only grow more disturbing, more revealing, and more unforgettable. Now, let's keep going. Case 2. Bob Coy. The world of Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale was built on the promise of purity. Rows of eager congregants packing into one of America's fastest-growing megachurches, hanging on to every word as Bob Coy preached with a mixture of fatherly warmth and uncompromising conviction. Week after week, he told tens of thousands that the path to holiness required strict sexual discipline, marital fidelity, and absolute self-control. He spoke about resisting temptation with the confidence of a man who seemed to have mastered it. His sermons about abstinence before marriage and the sanctity of the family were so polished, so passionate, that people walked away believing he lived exactly what he preached. From the stage, he painted himself as a shepherd guarding his flock from the corruption of the world, a moral leader who had conquered the very weaknesses he warned everyone else about. And for years it worked. Families trusted him, young couples idolized him, entire communities shaped their understanding of purity through his voice. But behind the scenes, the story was already starting to rot. The man who stood on stage telling his congregation to flee from sin was quietly plunging headfirst into the very behaviors he condemned so ruthlessly. Coy had built a life on a platform of purity, but he was living a parallel existence, one that involved secret hotel rooms, hidden phone calls, and a string of affairs that stood in direct opposition to the persona he had carefully constructed. What made the hypocrisy even more devastating was how far his influence stretched. This wasn't a small church scandal. Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale, was one of the largest congregations in the country, drawing more than 20,000 people every weekend. His fall wouldn't just bruise a community, it would fracture a spiritual empire. The exposure began quietly, in whispers behind closed doors among senior staff who noticed inconsistencies, unexplained absences, and behavior that didn't match the pastor the world believed in. Those whispers eventually solidified into an undeniable truth. Coy had been living a double life. Multiple extramarital affairs surfaced, alongside a long-term addiction to pornography that directly contradicted everything he stood for on stage. As the truth emerged, the leadership confronted him, expecting, perhaps, an attempt at denial, but Coy admitted what he had done. The man who had built his entire reputation on moral strength confessed he had been violating the very rules he demanded from everyone else. Once his admissions were documented, the fallout became unstoppable. In April 2014, Bob Coy resigned abruptly, sending shockwaves through the church community. Congregants who had idolized him felt blindsided, some devastated, others furious at being so deeply misled. The church issued statements acknowledging the moral failings, but the damage had already spread far beyond its walls. Local news outlets descended on the story, national media amplified it, and the scandal quickly evolved from a pastoral failure into a symbol of megachurch hypocrisy. The investigation into his misconduct was not a criminal one. It didn't involve the FBI or hidden victims crossing state lines. Instead, it was a moral investigation pieced together from testimonies, internal documents, and Coy's own admissions. The betrayal was not illegal, it was spiritual. But for people who had trusted him to shape their lives, their marriages, and their understanding of purity itself, the impact was just as severe. Members described feeling manipulated, deceived, and spiritually wounded, especially those who had internalized the purity culture he preached with such fire. Many said it felt like a rug had been pulled from under an entire generation. His downfall was swift and total. One day he was the charismatic face of a religious powerhouse. The next, he was a disgraced figure whose sermons were removed from the church's website entirely. Some of his followers tried to defend him, but most were left grappling with disillusionment. The church, once defined by his booming presence, had to restructure everything, from leadership to messaging, to distance itself from the implosion of its former pastor. Today, Bob Coy remains one of the most haunting examples of purity-preaching hypocrisy in modern American Christianity. A man who built a career warning others about moral decay had been hiding the decay within himself for years. And the thousands who sat under his teaching were left with a painful reminder that sometimes the loudest purity preacher is the one running hardest from his own secrets. Case 3. Bill Gothard. For decades, Bill Gothard stood at the center of a purity empire that shaped the beliefs, routines, and even the daily habits of hundreds of thousands of conservative Christian families. His seminars filled convention halls across America, where wide-eyed teenagers and anxious parents listened to him outline a world where every moral danger lurked just beyond the boundary lines he so meticulously drew. Gothard didn't simply preach purity, he constructed an entire lifestyle around it. Strict courtship rules, bans on dating, obsessive modesty standards, and a belief that even fleeting impure thoughts could compromise a person's spiritual destiny. Young girls were told their value rested in absolute chastity, while young men were warned that a single misstep could unleash lifelong shame. In that world of rigid expectations, Gothard wasn't merely a teacher. He was the architect of an entire culture of moral fear, one where purity wasn't encouraged, it was enforced. Yet even as families restructured their lives around his teachings, rumors began surfacing from inside his organization. Quiet whispers from former staffers, many of them young women, who described uncomfortable touches, long, lingering hugs, late-night counseling sessions, and attention that felt less like spiritual guidance and more like something predatory. For years, those whispers were dismissed or suppressed, because who would dare believe that the man who built an empire on purity could violate the very boundaries he preached? But the stories kept coming, each one echoing the others: inappropriate comments, isolation of young female staff, and behavior that contradicted everything he thundered from stage after stage. Eventually, the dam broke. Investigative reports and public testimonies revealed a pattern that shredded the image Gothard had carefully constructed. Dozens of women came forward, describing what they called manipulation, harassment, and psychological control under the guise of mentorship. They talked about the pressure to remain silent, the culture of unquestioning obedience, and the way purity theology itself became a weapon, one that kept them ashamed, uncertain, and unable to challenge the man at the center of it all. Gothard denied the most serious allegations, but the sheer volume of accounts made it impossible for his organization to defend his continued leadership. The investigation into his behavior wasn't criminal, no charges were filed, but the fallout was devastating nonetheless. Gothard was forced to resign from the ministry he created, a ministry that once shaped homeschooling culture nationwide. His carefully curated image of moral authority collapsed almost overnight, replaced by public outrage, internal fractures within his followers, and documentaries exposing the severity of the harm caused by his purity-obsessed teachings. For many who grew up under his rules, the revelations felt like a profound betrayal, proof that the man who demanded spotless moral perfection from everyone else could not maintain it himself. And in that contradiction, his entire empire unraveled. leaving behind wounded families and former followers still trying to reclaim their lives from a worldview built on fear, shame, and the authority of a man who failed to live up to his own standards. Case 4. John Howard Yoder. The unraveling of John Howard Yoder's public image begins not in scandal, but in reverence. For decades, he was celebrated as one of the most brilliant theologians of the 20th century, an intellectual giant whose teachings on Christian ethics, nonviolence, and sexual holiness influenced churches, seminaries, and academic institutions across the world. His soft-spoken manner, his carefully reasoned writings, and his reputation for moral clarity made him a towering authority on what it meant to live a life of radical purity and submission to Christ. Generations of students studied under him, believing they were in the presence of a man whose personal life reflected the integrity of his teachings. His writings on sexuality and discipleship were held up as gold standards within Christian academia, but behind the gentle public persona and his celebrated ideas on holiness, something darker was taking shape, something that would only fully surface after his death. Over time, stories began spreading quietly among women who had interacted with Yoder in professional and spiritual settings. Stories that did not match the saintly reputation he had cultivated. In private, he had been approaching women for what he described as theological experiments, a chilling phrase later revealed to be his justification for violating boundaries, manipulating power dynamics, and exploiting the trust placed in him as a spiritual authority. Dozens of women eventually stepped forward, describing a pattern of unwanted advances, coercive behavior, and spiritual reasoning used to blur consent and silence objections. Many of these encounters happened in contexts where women believed they were receiving academic guidance or spiritual mentorship, only to realize they were being drawn into situations engineered to satisfy Yoder's private impulses. Because of his influence and prestige, most of the women stayed silent for years, unsure whether they would be believed. After Yoder's death in 1997, the truth finally ripped its way into public view. Investigations launched by Mennonite institutions uncovered extensive documentation of misconduct, including internal reports showing that leaders had been aware of concerns for decades but had failed to act decisively. The revelations sent shockwaves through theological circles that had long revered his work. The contrast between his published teachings on purity and the hidden reality of his actions ignited widespread outrage. Churches issued apologies, academic boards convened inquiries, and institutions that once celebrated him were forced to confront the decades-long harm they had enabled through silence. In the end, Yoder's legacy became a cautionary tale about moral hypocrisy on the most devastating scale. Proof that even those who speak endlessly about purity can hide the most persistent violations of it, leaving behind victims who suffered in the shadow of his brilliance and the institutions that protected it for far too long. Case 5. Bob Gray. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, Bob Gray had built his reputation on sermons that thundered against moral compromise and sexual sin. From the pulpit of Trinity Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida, he projected an image of uncompromising purity, an old-school, iron-fisted preacher who warned his congregation that even the smallest crack of impurity could destroy a soul. Families entrusted him with their children because he portrayed himself as a guardian of innocence, a moral watchdog who seemed utterly incapable of violating the standards he preached. But behind the powerful sermons and strict rules, a horrifying secret was taking shape, one that would only begin to surface decades later, long after the damage had been done. The facade began to crumble when, in the early 2000s, adults who had once been children in Gray's church came forward with memories they had spent years trying to suppress. Their stories were disturbingly similar. Private meetings behind closed doors, inappropriate touching masked as spiritual guidance, and a culture of silence that made speaking out feel impossible. The allegations were not momentary lapses or isolated incidents. they painted a picture of long-term, systematic abuse, carried out by a man who preached purity while violating the very children he claimed to protect. As more victims stepped forward, the public began to understand that the moral authority he wielded had been a tool of manipulation, giving him access, credibility, and cover. Once the first accusations broke through the surface, law enforcement began digging into the history of this seemingly untouchable preacher. Investigators uncovered testimony from multiple victims who described experiences dating back decades. The church, once one of the most respected fundamentalist institutions in the region, found itself pulled into a storm of scrutiny. Elders questioned, old records examined, and former members interviewed. Prosecutors eventually brought charges against Gray, and the revelations were devastating not just because of the crimes themselves, but because the person responsible had built his ministry on condemning the very sins he secretly committed. To many who had spent years under his teaching, the betrayal felt uniquely personal, as if the ground they had built their faith on had been ripped out from under them. But before he could stand trial, before victims could take the stand and confront him, Bob Gray's story came to a sudden end. In 2007, shortly after his arrest, he died, leaving behind unanswered questions, unresolved anger, and a congregation forced to reconcile the preacher they thought they knew with the predator he had been revealed to be. His death meant no conviction, no formal legal resolution, and no moment of public accountability. What remained instead was a community fractured by betrayal, victims left without the closure of a courtroom verdict, and a haunting reminder that the loudest voices preaching purity are sometimes the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Case 6. Paul Cain. Paul Cain built a public image that seemed almost designed to repel the ordinary temptations that dog so many high-profile ministers. Austere, celibate, and fiercely devoted to prophetic ministry, he walked into rooms with a calm authority that convinced colleagues and congregants alike that he had been set apart for a different kind of holiness. For decades, he moved through evangelical and charismatic circles as a respected itinerant prophet, counseling leaders, pronouncing words of direction, and insisting that his life was marked by spiritual discipline rather than worldly indulgence. But the carefully cultivated facade began to crack as rumors and private complaints surfaced, and what had once been whispered behind closed doors spilled into public view. Paul Cain struggled with alcoholism, and allegations emerged of sexual impropriety with younger men who had been drawn into his orbit. In an astonishing, painful turn for many who had trusted him without question, Cain ultimately acknowledged aspects of that private chaos, admitting to the struggles with alcohol and accepting disciplinary measures from peers in the prophetic community. The confession did not undo the hurt, rather it amplified it. Former protégés felt betrayed, and longtime supporters had to wrestle with the cognitive dissonance of a man who preached celibacy and purity while secretly failing to live up to those standards. The ministry networks that once amplified his voice moved to distance themselves, issuing formal rebukes and implementing safeguards meant to prevent similar abuses of influence. Today, Cain's legacy is permanently shaded by the contrast between his public persona and private failures. A cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority, the human vulnerability behind prophetic charisma, and the cost borne by followers who invest absolute trust in leaders presented as morally untouchable. Case 7. Ernest Angley. As the spotlight of televangelism beamed across his sprawling ministry, Ernest Angley positioned himself as the uncompromising guardian of holiness, purity, and strict moral discipline. His empire revolved around a sharp, clean-cut image of righteous living, and his booming sermons left no room for ambiguity. He condemned sexual sin with absolute certainty, framing himself as a spiritual father whose word was unquestionable. In his world, purity wasn't just expected, it was demanded, enforced, and weaponized. Followers approached him with deep reverence, believing he possessed a unique spiritual authority to cleanse them from any moral stain. But behind the immaculate stage persona and the polished television broadcasts, whispers of disturbing contradictions began to leak out. Former church members eventually stepped forward with testimonies that painted a drastically different picture of the man who preached purity so aggressively. Court documents and investigative reports revealed allegations that Angley coerced male staff members into unwanted sexual encounters under the guise of spiritual guidance. Several men claimed that he pressured them into vasectomies, insisting it was God's will and part of maintaining holiness within the ministry. Others reported emotional manipulation and an environment where questioning the leader's actions was equated with questioning God himself. The more survivors spoke, the clearer it became that purity teaching had become a tool of fear and control rather than moral guidance. As the accusations mounted and lawsuits surfaced, the public image Angley had crafted for decades began to crumble. Investigations exposed a pattern of spiritual coercion that contradicted everything he proclaimed from the pulpit. For many followers, the scandal was more than a headline. It was a profound betrayal from the very man who had taught them that purity was the highest expression of devotion. The collapse of his moral authority left lasting wounds, and even after his death, the shadow of his hypocrisy lingered as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked spiritual power. Case 8. Carlton Funderburk. Carlton Funderburk built his reputation on the language of holiness, pastoral dignity, and obedience to spiritual authority, presenting himself as a man deeply committed to purity of life and purity of leadership. His sermons often warned against pride, vanity, and the dangers of straying from righteous living, messages delivered with the confidence of a man who claimed to embody the very virtues he demanded from his congregation. But all of that carefully curated spiritual authority began to crumble the moment a single live stream clip went viral, exposing a very different version of the preacher behind the pulpit. During what was supposed to be a routine online sermon, Funderburk launched into an explosive tirade, berating his congregation for their disobedience and lack of honor, because they had not purchased the luxury watch he wanted. His voice sharpened with irritation as he called them broke, cheap, and spiritually immature for failing to meet what he framed as an expectation of pastoral appreciation. The rant spread across social media within hours. Millions watching a preacher who had spent years insisting on purity and humility suddenly reveal raw entitlement, materialism, and manipulation. The backlash was immediate and intense. Members of his own church expressed shock at the hypocrisy. Outsiders condemned his behavior as spiritual bullying, and national media outlets used the incident as yet another example of ego-driven pastoral culture. Though he issued an apology, many felt it lacked sincerity, given how sharply the video contrasted with his public preaching. In the aftermath, the scandal didn't result in criminal charges like others on this list, but it delivered a devastating blow to his credibility. For many viewers, the moment he demanded luxury while preaching purity became the defining and irreversible exposure of who he really was. Case 9. Clarence McClendon. Clarence McClendon cultivated an image built on elegance, charisma, and uncompromising teachings about marital purity, commitment, and holiness. Night after night, his services blended polished sermons with emotional appeals for families to honor the covenant of marriage. He spoke often about fidelity, divine ardor in the home, and the sacred responsibility of a spiritual leader to reflect moral discipline. His words carried weight because he delivered them with the confidence of a man who seemed to embody the very principles he preached. Congregants described feeling both inspired and convicted as he urged them to guard their relationships with vigilance, warning that moral failure could unravel everything God intended for their lives. Within this environment, his voice became synonymous with marriage ethics, someone followers looked to as a model of what faithful leadership should look like. But behind the pulpit's glow, the image began to fracture. McClendon's personal life unfolded in ways that sharply contradicted the ideals he championed. His multiple divorces, each one increasingly public and heavily scrutinized, clashed directly with the purity and marital stability he urged his congregation to pursue. Critics pointed out that he was preaching holiness and commitment while navigating a private life marked by discord and emotional upheaval. As the headlines multiplied, the contrast between his sermons and his reality became impossible to ignore. Former supporters whispered that his teachings began to sound less like spiritual guidance and more like hollow performance, an echo of moral expectations he couldn't maintain in his own home. The tension between message and messenger grew into a shadow that followed him everywhere. The public fallout was swift and merciless. Commentators questioned whether someone who struggled so visibly with the principles of purity had any right to instruct others on the subject. Members of his congregation felt a deep sense of confusion and betrayal. Many had shaped their actions around the very teachings he appeared unable or unwilling to live by. The hypocrisy became a point of national commentary in Christian circles, turning McClendon into a symbol of the gap that can exist between polished preaching and messy private lives. Even though his controversies did not involve criminal behavior, the moral dissonance shattered his credibility in the eyes of many. The once towering figure of authority found himself navigating an awkward landscape of lost trust, fractured reputation, and a legacy permanently complicated by the very failures he warned others to avoid. Case 10. Juanita Bynum. For years, Juanita Bynum stood as one of the most recognizable faces in the global purity movement. Her sermons, conferences, and best-selling messages, especially her famous No More Sheets, teaching painted her as a woman who had overcome her past, conquered sexual sin, and stepped fully into holiness. She spoke to millions with raw honesty about her struggles and insisted that purity wasn't just a lifestyle but a divine calling. Churches packed out whenever she preached, and her testimony became a lifeline for believers desperate to break free from cycles of guilt and shame. From the outside, she appeared to embody the very purity she proclaimed with such intensity. But what made her message so powerful also made the eventual fracture so devastating. The woman who convinced thousands to surrender their lives to God's standards suddenly found herself in a storm of public controversy. In 2012, when Bynum was arrested in Dallas for failing to appear in court over a fraud dispute tied to a speaking engagement, the shock rippled across the Christian world. For her followers, seeing her mugshot circulate online felt like an earthquake. Here was the celebrated prophetess, the voice of purity, discipline, and spiritual excellence, being escorted into custody like a common offender. Even worse, the case reopened old criticisms, stirring conversations about money, misrepresentation, and the blurred lines around high-profile ministry bookings. As reporters dug deeper, additional controversies resurfaced: financial disputes, public relational conflicts, and accusations that her ministry lifestyle didn't match the disciplined purity she demanded of her audience. Critics argued that her message had become overshadowed by spectacle, luxury, and a growing disconnect between what she preached and what she practiced. Supporters tried to defend her, insisting that even spiritual leaders faced unjust attacks and human struggles, but the damage was already done. The narrative had shifted from powerful purity preacher to embattled public figure fighting to maintain credibility. For a movement built on absolute moral clarity, the arrest became a symbolic turning point. Churches that once promoted her conferences quietly distanced themselves. Believers who once repeated her teachings with confidence now questioned whether her platform had become a brand rather than a calling. And while she continued preaching, releasing books, and attempting to rebuild her image, the purity mantle she once wore so boldly had been permanently stained by controversy. Her story became yet another reminder woven throughout this documentary. When a preacher builds an empire on purity, the fall is always louder, harsher, and more haunting than the rise. In the end, these 10 stories form a haunting reminder that the loudest voices preaching purity are often the ones hiding the deepest contradictions. Their messages promised holiness, discipline, and moral perfection, yet behind the pulpit lights and choreographed sermons lived a very different reality, one shaped by secrecy, ego, addiction, abuse, and the quiet unraveling of the personas they worked so hard to maintain. Each fall left a trail of disillusioned believers who had trusted them with their spiritual lives, only to discover that the people they looked up to were wrestling with the very sins they condemned. And long after the headlines faded, the damage within families, churches, and communities continued to echo, proving that the cost of hypocrisy is never paid by the preacher alone. It is carried by the people who believed them. But scandals don't just expose individuals, they raise deeper questions about charisma, trust, and the dangerous power of placing leaders on pedestals. When purity is preached like a weapon, when fear or guilt keeps people silent, and when a leader presents himself as morally untouchable, the stage is set for devastation. These stories show what happens when devotion turns into blindness, when accountability disappears, and when the myth of perfection becomes more important than the truth. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these cases shocked you the most? And why do you think so many people overlook red flags when a preacher presents himself as the guardian of purity? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm always reading.